Morning, everyone.
Good morning.
So I'm Roshan Samara, and I'm the program director of Land Use and Housing at Urban Habitat. We're a small nonprofit. Our office is in Oakland, but we work throughout the Bay Area. I direct the Land Use and Housing program. And in this panel, I'm also, on the later panel, I'll talk about something else. But for this panel, I'm going to talk about a, yes?
I'm wondering if you could stand up because your voice is kind
Is not carried, sure.
traveling all the way back.
What I'm going to talk about is a report that we released almost a year ago, November of 2016, called Race, Inequality, and Resegregation of the Bay Area. We're a pretty applied organization, so prior to coming to Urban Habitat in 2014, I worked as a sociologist, and the shift in the kind of focus of the work I did was really interesting. And one of the things I really noticed was how important it was for us as an advocacy organization that was trying to work with community groups that were working primarily around displacement, was how when we talked to whether it's policymakers or city staff or media, there was always this push for data. And it's in some ways a trap, because you never have enough data to prove the things that they want you to prove, and you're kind of chasing a moving target. At the same time, we want to be involved in setting the narrative around the kinds of issues that we are interested in. So on the one hand, we put out these reports occasionally to provide some of the data, both to ourselves and to the groups that we work with, for them to use. And it's also a way to attempt to shape the debate. And in some ways, I think that latter piece is the most important. At least it's been that's been my experience to date, is that the really critical political fights are not around who has the best data, but around who actually controls the narrative. So anyway, that's the introduction to the report. So I've been doing this work at Urban Habitat for almost 4 years, working primarily with anti-displacement and tenants' rights groups. That's not the whole range of housing work. I mean, if you pay any attention to the debates around housing in California and in the Bay Area, you probably are more likely to hear about the need to build more. That is the dominant narrative around the housing crisis, is we just haven't built enough. 90% of the work I do has very little to do with actually construction of new housing, particularly market rate, but even affordable. It's about defending people in the homes that they're already in, and those people are by and large renters. So I'm going to begin by showing a few maps that we generated in the report, and then spend most of the time really just talking about how we're interpreting this data and why it may be important, particularly for the Bay Area, but also about how we think about metro regions in general in the United States. I don't think it's relevant in the same ways once we leave the United States. First, a few kind of overarching comments. So the first thing we did was we looked at 11 counties, which is typically when people talk about the Bay Area region, they're talking about 9 counties. So we added 2. We added Stanislaus and San Joaquin to the east. The reason being that through our work, we were hearing more and more about people being pushed out beyond the traditional 9 counties into these even further out counties, and still many of them commuting back into work, often doing 2 to 3 hours each way. There's a whole bunch of stories about what that actually looks like, but for us, it seemed important to at least consider the fact that 9 counties no longer constituted the entire Bay Area region, that it was now at least an 11-county region. You certainly could make an argument that Santa Cruz County and Monterey County should also be included, and for a number of reasons, we just were not able to get that expansive in this first cut, so we looked at 11 counties. So all of the data that I'm looking at, that I'm going to show you, is 11 counties between 2000 and 2014. We looked at a couple of big ticket items. We looked at where poverty was growing, where black populations were leaving and where they were growing, Latino populations, Asian populations, rise in renter households, and commute times. Those are the big things we looked at. And the report's on our website for free. You can download it anytime. A couple of the things that stood out to us and that we kind of highlight in the executive summary. One was that there was a clear and dramatic shift in black population from the inner part of the region to the outer part of the region. And the region as a whole, the 11 counties, saw a net loss of 22,000 black residents between 2000 and 2014. So that was pretty striking. The map you see here is actually just a very simple way of capturing percentage changes in poverty. So the darker the shading, the more increase in poverty during that period. And as you see, the major areas of increase were in the kind of outer parts of the region, and less growth typically in the inner parts of the region. And I'm not sure how familiar folks are with the area, but just to orient us all, as you can see where San Francisco is, the further south you go into San Mateo and Santa Clara, that's Silicon Valley. You go up north, that's one country. And then to the east, which is into Contra Costa, Alameda, and the two new counties that we looked at. Actually getting into fairly rural areas, even though we still consider it part of the metro region. So we saw this shift in where poverty is increasing relative to other places, and this demographic shift of black population. And while poverty in black communities increased overall, it increased most dramatically in the outer parts of the region. So we saw, generally speaking, we looked at about 117 jurisdictions, looking at only those over 10,000, population of 10,000. And while poverty in black communities grew everywhere, they grew most dramatically in the outer parts of the region. The Latino population grew overall in the region, so unlike the black population, there was a net gain of about 500,000 over this period. But most of the growth was in the outer regional parts of the Bay Area, which is interesting because typically you think of when there's, particularly in migration, whether it's from other parts of the country or from abroad, the first destinations typically, historically, have been into inner regional, inner city areas, right? That, you know, coming off the Brookings suburbanization poverty work and all that, we see that that's changing. We don't know exactly how it's changing, but clearly there's a shift, and part of that shift is people coming from out of the region or out of the country more likely to end up in the outer parts of the region first, as opposed to first going in and moving out. Poverty in Latino communities increased disproportionately. Oh, actually, shift next. Still the same one. Yeah, there we go. Which one is this? Oh, this is just the East Bay. You can jump by this one. These are, we looked at them in three, we broke the region up into 3 pieces to look at. There we go. So this is the one capturing black population shift. So the areas with the green arrows pointing up, that's where we saw increases. The red arrows pointing down is where we saw losses. So again, if you look at the center, San Mateo, Oakland, San Francisco, Oakland, down into Silicon Valley, typically we saw losses, and then the increases in black population in the further outer parts of the region. Next one. And this is Latino population, a little bit more dispersed, but still I think the same general trend. Decreases in proportional populations in inner parts of the region, with some exceptions into Contra Costa, but further growth in the outer parts of the region. And maybe was that the last one? Maybe that one.
So in your mind, we can kind of conflate poverty and color?
Well, not necessarily. The increase and decrease in populations isn't just low-income populations, this is overall. So for example, we know there's growth in middle-class black and Latino populations in the outer parts of the region as well, for example, because they can afford homes there, as opposed to the red-hot prices that we see in the region. Mm-hmm. So I don't think we can just say that this corresponds directly to increases in only low-income populations. And that's, you know, part of the thing, and I'll get to this in a second, we use the term resegregation in the title of the report. And segregation is not just about class, not just about race, but about the movement of entire populations around different income levels. And then places with higher rates of poverty among the Asian communities was more dispersed. And that's, you know, for a number of reasons, including that it's an aggregate of so many different groups that it's much more difficult in some ways to just lump that into one category. But there was more dispersion there. The other thing we saw was that there was more growth in renter-occupied units relative to owner-occupied units in the outer part of the region. Which is interesting because the outer parts of the region are the ones that were hit really hard in the foreclosure crisis. So if you look at the data from, let's say, 2005 to 2012, the foreclosure crisis in the Bay Area was centered in places like Contra Costa County, parts of Alameda County. And now those are also places where we're seeing an increase in proportion of renter households, primarily in single-family homes, meaning that a lot of the homes that were owned in 2005 are now rented in 2014. This is one of the areas where some of the big Wall Street landlords like Blackstone and Innovation Homes have been buying up properties in bulk, converting them to rentals. So, two points on how we've been trying to make sense of these trends for our work. As I said, we use the term resegregation, and we use that obviously intentionally. We define it in the report very simply as the unequal allocation of land resources and political power on the basis of race and ethnicity within a defined place. And we actually struggled a bit internally at the organization about whether this was the right term to use. And the reasons why we ended up doing so are, one is that it situates the shifts that we're talking about, that we're looking at, linked to gentrification and displacement, which are typically the primary ways that people talk about the housing crisis in the Bay Area is around displacement, gentrification, exclusion, suburbs that are so expensive or jurisdictions that are so expensive that people can't move in the first place. So it's a kind of preemptive displacement. It situates all of those shifts within the broader context of US history, where we have a very clear and well understood frame around segregation. It seemed important to us to make sure that we really center how this is linked to that longer history and doesn't somehow represent a break in that history. So that was one reason.
Excuse me, how would you distinguish segregation from resegregation?
It's just a new version of it. It looks different, right? So segregation in 1950 looks different than this, but they're both different forms of segregation. So the shift that we're talking about is not just about starting in, let's say, the 1970s and 80s, the rediscovery of urban land markets, right? That's part of it. But it's also a new chapter in the long-running story of accumulation by dispossession, like to use David Harvey's term. A more recent one that I like, although I haven't read the book, just his articles, Richard Reeves talking about resource hoarding, the way that upper middle class and upper class communities basically hoard wealth and do that geographically, spatially. And of course the racialized distribution of landed wealth throughout US history. So it seemed important for us to ground what often become very, very kind of narrowly focused and temporally focused debates about the present, really removed from the historical currents that they so clearly are a part of. The second is that the concept of, and this was something that seemed really important for the shaping the narrative at this point, that the concept of resegregation allowed us to speak back to a lot of the arguments that we dealt with on a daily basis in the work itself. For example, people move all the time, right? We heard this a lot. You know, why are you talking about displacement? People are always moving. Show us a period of US history when people were not moving. Well, obviously we don't deny that people always move, but we're more interested in why they move and where they move. And so this seemed an important way to frame, or at least speak back to some of that kind of attempt to naturalize the displacement and the disruption of entire communities. And it also puts focus on the fact that this movement is often the result of a lot of work. It's not natural, and often that work involves violence. Another argument we hear is that, well, this is actually good. Cities and regions are becoming more diverse. Go into the Mission, which is kind of like the symbol of displacement in San Francisco. And there are people who, you know, with some superficial level of understandable, argue that the Mission is now more diverse than it was before. And this is a good thing, right? And part of what we captured was that that diversity is really about the number of different populations passing each other. One group coming in, one group coming out. And if you, or not one, but a number of groups, and if you take a snapshot of that at any given moment, it could look like diversity. But over time, what you're seeing is that they're actually passing each other. And the third argument that we heard a lot, this was meant to speak back to, which is that we don't really know where all this is going, right? Yes, people are moving. Yes, sometimes it's, you know, displacement, but we can't really say how it's all going to shake out. So don't presume that this is a negative or a problem. Don't assume the worst. We had been doing, and through the many, many groups that we work with throughout the region, we knew that for most people this was a very bad thing that was happening. And stepping back a bit from the report, I do think there are limits to the resegregation frame. But for the purposes of this work, it's been really important and really valuable, particularly in light of Ben Carson taking over at HUD, where there's been lots of concern around how the affirmatively furthering fair housing work is going to go, which is HUD's attempt to do something around civil rights and housing. In San Mateo County, where I work on a number of campaigns, a lot of those cities are going through their fair housing update. And we worked very hard to insert the discourse of housing as a civil right and displacement as a civil right barrier to fair housing into how they do their assessments. We don't think that Carson's going to care, but it's important still at the local and at the state level to get that in there. So we've really worked to try to make sure that when people think about displacement and think about barriers to fair housing, that they link those two. Because typically, you think about barriers to fair housing having to do with inability to buy or inability to borrow. And the second reason, and this is, I'm starting to wrap up here, the second reason that we look at this, or that we wanted to use this frame, is that looking at these trends from a regional perspective allows us to kind of say things about the relationship between displacement in the regional core and increasing poverty on the region's edges. One thing we often will come up against, usually implicitly, is that what's happening in San Francisco and what's happening in Eastern Contra Costa County aren't really that related. And that's changed. I mean, I think in the last 4 or 5 years we've seen some shifting around that, particularly around transportation and commutes, but even more also around jobs. So there's lots of attention to displacement, right? And when I first arrived in the Bay to do this work in 2014, everyone was talking about gentrification. Everyone was talking about displacement, which is good, as we should be. But there was less attention to what was happening in the places either where people were being displaced to, which was becoming more and more of a concern, and also, as I indicated earlier, places where people, especially lower income people working in the many, many service jobs that the red hot Silicon Valley economy creates, where do they go first? So you have 3 pressures into this growth of poverty in the suburbs. People being displaced, people coming in from other places and arriving and working in low-wage jobs and therefore being low income from the get-go, and people who are growing poor in place. People who have been in these areas already and are downwardly mobile. So we wanted to link these and say that displacement in the Mission, displacement in Oakland, and increase in poverty in Eastern Contra Costa County are actually part of the same process. Partly this was because there was a tendency, or I saw a tendency, around the housing crisis work to really just jump from one neighborhood to another, to say displacement's happening here, we need to focus on this neighborhood. Then it's done at some level, and then people move on to the next one. It's kind of piecemeal. We wanted to begin to tie some of this together and figure out ways to use that in the campaigns themselves. It also allows us to look simultaneously at where it's happening now and the sequence of events that the process of displacement sets off. So displacement in one place actually sets off a chain reaction of events which ripples geographically, especially throughout the region. And we also wanted to really frame anti-displacement movements as anti-segregationist movements, to really bring in the discourse of rights, whether we're talking about civil rights or human rights, and really talk about landlords in the real estate industry, which are horribly nasty actors in this fight, really put them also in historical context. And we can get into this later in the discussion, but the language that is used against the tenant campaigns throughout the Bay Area is taken right out of the 1950s, right? It's really, really clear. And yet we're working in a lot of suburbs where there's not an overt discourse of race or class at all. And so it's very hard to make advances in situating housing and the displacement crisis in this way when we're in liberal suburbs that don't think there's really a race problem. Real quick, so partly for us what we were doing here was trying to figure out what would it look like to actually support work, not in the places where displacement is red hot, but in some of the places where people are being pushed out to or where poverty is growing for any of the 3 reasons I talked about. And while places like Oakland and San Francisco have enormous amounts of challenges, they also have enormous amounts of organizing. We're seeing now more and more people pushed into places where there's very little tradition of organizing, little interest and sometimes often hostility to new arrivals that are low-income people of color, few resources, right? So again, not that we have enough resources in San Francisco and Oakland to fight this, but compared to places in southern Santa Clara and in Eastern Contra Costa, even the foundations don't put money out there. There's just very little ability to mobilize resources for people to organize. And again, the organizing challenges are bigger in many ways. So there's a range of challenges that we're recognizing now if we're going to actually say that these are the areas where over the next 20, 30, 40 years, this is where populations, low-income populations of color and populations of color in general are moving to. If this is where they're going to be, we need to think about building the political infrastructure to deal with the many challenges that they're going to face out there. And again, it doesn't mean that we kind of pull up our stakes and leave the fights in the inner region. We have to figure out a way to do both, and we report with an attempt, at least analytically, conceptually, link those two things together with some data to do that. So I'll stop there. I think I'm just about out of time. Thank you.